This is this is a Sinister Society podcast where we are going to be talking to Marie Lestrange, who is the author of Crimson Cobblestones and her new book, The Devil's Colony, which well, it's kind of a cross between historical and horror fiction, right?
Definitely. I think that's my entire brand as a whole, other than it's like spooky, spicy, but rooted in historical in all things. So Crimson Cobblestone,
Right.
that one, that was Benjamin Franklin, serial killer, sex cults, lots of fun stuff there. And for Devil's Colony, I wanted to take it way back to the Lost Colony of Roanoke.
Right. Okay. It's very interesting. So what inspired you to write a story about the colony of Roanoke, and what made you think it would be a good setting for a horror story?
Yeah, so I am a big genealogical researcher. I mean, a researcher at heart. So I have spent a lot of time looking back through my own family tree. I'm super fascinated by all of those things, especially for those that have been following my journey for a while. They know that my family tree changed recently. So I've had to do some new research, which has been exciting. And I discovered that my 14th great grandfather was the governor, the original governor of the Roanoke colony.
No
Uh,
way.
yeah. And I'm actually not sure. This will be interesting to hear from your point of view because the Lost Colony of Roanoke is something that it's like one of the great mysteries of the U.S.
Yeah.
Do you all have a familiarity with that mystery at all? Like, have you heard of that? Know what
Well,
that's about?
in the UK, I mean, yeah, yeah. It was kind of it was a settlement that just straight up vanished, right? And there was a writing on a an inscription somewhere, like on a tree or something, with a word that basically kind of just meant like gone,
Yeah.
right? Is that the one?
Basically, yeah. So
Mm.
the word that was left behind was Croatoan. And
Yes, of course, yeah.
yeah, so the very first colony was they attempted it like 30 years before the colony goes missing and it was a disaster. They had to abandon ship basically. The so my great grandfather was a complete asshat and he went after the neighboring Native American tribes and like slaughtered an entire tribe over a silver goblet. Like he was not a good man. And
Mm.
that's another part of these historical horrors that I write. I don't write them as romanticizing the time. I really go after the villains, the true
Right.
historical villains.
Yeah.
And Croatoan, some people have connected throughout the research that the Croatoan tribes that were in the area have eventually made it into what we now recognize as the Cherokee Indians. And I happen to also be a member of the Cherokee tribe. Okay. It's one of the Five
Oh.
Nations. And so I was just drawn to that topic as a whole. I thought, wow, all of this is so interconnected. I have to research more. I have to find out more about this. And so I thought blending that with, taking true historical elements that happened in the time and, when they came back to the colony, what did they find? And the first person that was born on the shores of America, Virginia
Oh, okay.
Dare. And I thought I would just take that entire family and then um, really bastardize it. So I
Right.
incorporate quite a bit of Appalachian folklore and some occult elements, witchcraft, and with a heavy, heavy veil of puritanical oppression and just religious trauma sprinkled all over the top of it.
Oh,
So
right. So it sounds like
yeah.
you kind of have a personal investment in this story then.
Oh yeah, I would say every novel that I write, I become very I start with something that piques my interest and usually it's because I have a personal connection to it. Crimson Cobblestone, same thing. I
Hmm.
very, very distantly, long time ago, my ancestor founded the Hellfire Club, which Benjamin Franklin was a part
Whoa,
of, and
okay.
the Hellfire Club. Yeah, so I'm again personally connected to that, and I just find that so fascinating, and I love being able to just kind of tap into that little piece of my own history in a way,
Mm,
and then completely um just what's the term I'm looking for? Like twist it into historical fiction. I think that's something too. People, when they read my books, I hope they're not going in expecting like accurate historical record. Like these are not
right.
fiction books. These are supposed to be fantastical, horror, scary, brutal,
Mm.
fictionalized history, alternative history, if you will.
Yes, yeah, yeah. No, I completely get what you're talking about. It's quite funny actually because I've been thinking over the past couple of months about how I had no interest in certain aspects of history as a kid, but it's through fiction and it's through fiction incorporating these elements of real history into their stories that are kind of makes me want to go and find out about that stuff. I mean, one example that's kind of coming to my mind is not in horror fiction, like kind of tangentially related to horror, but there's a manga called Berserk, which yeah, it's one of my favorite things ever, but that's a story for another time. But the setting of that is kind of it's in a sort of European medieval setting, and there's a war that has been going on for over 100 years that kind of provides the kind of setup for what happens between for the main characters in the story. And obviously you think kind of European historical setting,
Right.
the 100 Years War, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you start to think about like, well, this is based on something that actually like happened, like these stories of heroism and horror and romance and twisted romance. Like
Oh yeah.
it's it's kind of like those things were all inspired, like the bedrock of those is something that actually happened.
And I
I
love
mean,
that. I love that when people
yes, of
take
course,
a
yeah.
real event and then fictionalize it. Even George R. R. Martin with Game of Thrones, a lot of
I
that
was about
in the War
I
of the
was
Roses.
going to I
Yeah.
was going to say Game of Thrones, but I was like, oh, that's a too much of a obvious choice.
Oh yeah, no,
Yeah.
but I love that because truly history, I feel like as you get further into the research side of things and
Mm,
start learning more, I personally, as I start learning more about the time and just the cultural aspects, and I really try to look for as many primary resources as I can, diary entries.
right.
There's an epistolary an approach in Devil's Colony too, which I mean, forewarning, I really tried to stick with the language of the time for those paragraphs. They're like an opening prayer journal for each of my point of views within the book, and they are very pious, very,
Right.
like woe is me, I'm a sinner type
Hmm.
thing. But I mean, I really truly read as many diaries as I could that are still in existence from that time, from that little subset of people, just to give it that realistic feel. I wanted it to um, have that element. But then through reading those diary entries and reading the primary sources, you start learning all of the tea from back in the day.
Yeah,
And
of
it is
course, right?
wild. Like the story writes itself after when you start finding out all those little details and you're like, oh my gosh, this is scandalous. This has to go in the book.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
those are the pieces that is what makes writing fun for me. I love the writing and the prose and doing the atmospheric feel, but I honestly I think I have more fun with the researching side of it, all of the prep, because I'm such a psychotic plotter.
I
Um
can
yeah, like I spreadsheet after spreadsheet after spreadsheet. I think I had 32 sheets that went into writing
whoa,
Crimson
okay.
Cobblestones. Like
Mm,
I'm
mm.
crazy about it. So every scene is completely mapped out before I ever even write the first word of a novel. So
Right,
it takes me a while, but I then my editing afterwards is pretty quick because I've thought about it so much and ruminated on it so much before even writing the book. So,
right.
yeah, that research part that's the best part for me.
That actually that actually covers three questions that I was going to ask. I was going to ask, what do you what aspects of the history do you research? Where do you go to research them? And so I'm gonna go on to another question now, which is, as you say, like this meticulous planning with the historical research and everything, and that informing the what would you call it, like the legitimacy of the story and how rooted in reality it is. How then do you take the fantastical elements and still make those true to uh the research part of it? Like how, so obviously you're taking something that, this mystery, something that was never discovered, what happened to this colony, where did they go, turning it into a horror story. Yeah, what sort of inspires you when writing those bits?
So I really like to come at it from a perspective of an explanation. And so
Right,
coming up with, you take the parts that are known, that are historically proven, or that were true for the time, or cultural elements that are actually true for the time. And then you start explaining them in some way. It's like, okay, well, what did happen to the colony? Where did they go? Why was there smoke rising from the trees when Governor White came back to the shores 3 years later to check on the colony and they were gone? There was smoke all around, and it was, they had abandoned the colony, and only a carving remained on the tree. So then I start asking myself, well, why, what could have happened,
yeah, yeah.
and then those are my opportunities for really putting in the horror elements and the fictional fantastical elements. When you start thinking of smoke, well, where there's smoke there's fire, right? Well,
Yeah,
who started the fire? What's burning? What's going on?
yeah.
Who carved that in the tree? What did they use? Those sorts of things. I just try to take the elements that are true and then
Mhm.
start thinking of horrible, fantastical ways to explain them. And so that I love adding little historical pearls deep into my novels as well, things that people won't see on the first read through. For example, in Crimson Cobblestones, I really focused on the language of the flowers, the Victorian language of the flowers. And that's something that
Right.
characters in my book utilize when they're sending messages to each other using the language of the flowers. And there's even a guidebook talked about in there. Maybe one day I'll do a little companion book of the language of the flowers. We'll see.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
that's a
please
real
do.
thing that existed during that time.
Mm.
And so every mention of flowers in Crimson Cobblestones, if somebody's like walking by a garden and they notice the foxgloves or whatever, I attached that. I made sure that it matched the meaning of the Victorian language of the flowers of the time. And so if it's supposed to be, if that's some evil character's house, then I chose flowers that represented deceit or lies or
Oh,
something like that.
okay.
So it's very, very nuanced, and I love little layers like that. I know Bert, my husband, also an author, he gives me crap all the time for it. He's like, people are not going to realize that. I'm like, yeah, but the ones that do, they'll
Yeah, that's
they
it.
will love it. Like it's for the
That's
people
it,
like
isn't it?
me that
Yeah.
are like crazy about stuff like that. There's actually a book series, and I started reading it when I was like 9 years old, called Artemis Fowl. I don't know if you've ever heard
Oh, yeah,
of
of
that series.
course.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, I have.
So
Yeah.
in the very first copy in the first edition, Artemis Fowl, there are the symbols all around the edges of the pages on the book.
Cool. Yeah.
And it's the Elven, their tree of life language. And they have enough text within. I'm letting my nerd out right now.
That's fine. That's
Yeah,
fine.
this
This is
explains
the place to do
why I love
it.
these little pearls in my own books. Um, they actually, so like 10-year-old me discovered this, started making a chart. I kept up with what